All right, welcome to TKB Bench episode number 21. On this episode, we have a very special guest from Instagram. But meanwhile, Adi is here. Adi, say hi.
Hi guys. As you mentioned, this is a podcast we've been trying to do for a long time. This is a collab with Voices of Bhakti, and we have Nikhil from Voices of Bhakti. Hi Nikhil, uh,
Hey,
how are you doing?
nice to be here with both of you. And yeah, it's been a little bit of zigzag with the time zones and time difference, but yeah, really excited to be talking to both of you. My name is Nikhil. I'm based in Washington, D.C. And I run this Instagram account called at Voices of Bhakti, which I describe as kind of showcasing poetry from South Asia and also from beyond South Asia, but dealing with religion, caste, and gender, kind of those sort of themes. And so I take the phrase bhakti, or the word bhakti, is, I think, comes with a lot of associations and kind of notions of what it means. But for me, I define it in the very broadest sense of the word, of dealing with themes of devotion and spirituality and gender, but not being bound to what we think of as just the religious or the devotional. It
Mhm.
really intersects with so many other aspects of life and history in the world. So that is my elevator pitch for what this
Okay.
Instagram account is about. And should I start with sort of how I started, or?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Uh,
Sure. So yeah, so I guess I've always been very interested in history and culture and religion. So I grew up, I was since I was 1 year old, I've lived in the US. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and in the Indian community there, I grew up learning Carnatic music, like so many other children, Indian American kids are forced into dance or music or something. So I grew up learning Carnatic violin, and I did that through high school and then went to college. And I really developed a love for this art form, and kept performing in college. And as I started my college education, I also got very interested in like the history of this music that I was taught for most of my childhood, that this is divine music and it's x thousands of years old, and it's this pristine part of our culture. And then I actually started reading about the history and realizing that this is actually a modern, really modern art form. It's not this like ancient, pristine, untouched kind of tradition. It's affected by colonialism and by nationalism and caste and gender politics. And there's so much that goes into what we now think of as Indian classical dance and music. And for me, one of my first exposures to like breaking down those notions which I was taught as a child was coming across this collection of translations by these scholars, David Shulman, Velcheru Narayana Rao, and A.K. Ramanujan. And this collection is called When God is a Customer. And these are translations of padams and Telugu padams that are often sung now on concert stage, or also performed in Bharatanatyam kind of concerts. But many of these padams are also not performed because they're really like explicitly sexual and very graphic. And coming across these translations was the first time that I had seen any sort of like discussion of gender and sexuality happening in the framework of what I think of as classical music or dance. And for me to even like, it was hard for me to even comprehend that like this stuff was written in Telugu. Like I had grown up just associating my with my upbringing in a very conservative upper caste family, and this puritanical approach to sex and gender, which means it was never discussed at home. And then to realize that in part of this music which I grew up, there's this whole dimension of really erotic kind of bhakti poetry, and one that has been suppressed by kind of upper caste men who are in charge of the whole Carnatic music world. And so that was my first kind of glimpse into like the possibilities of this type of literature to really like push back against what are the really dominant and kind of powerful myths that we're told about what does it mean to be Indian, or what does it mean to be Hindu, or what does it mean to be, XYZ. These are all generalizations that fall apart once you actually look at the history and the complexity in all of these poems and literature forms. And so that's my starting point, just kind of like there's so much here which doesn't match up to what you're taught as a kid or learn in school. And I think that's really important to highlight, especially today.
Yeah, that's actually very true. Like even in Chennai, which we have a huge Carnatic scene in Chennai, right? Even in a place like that, that part of the history is barely spoken about. It's again, it's presented as something ancient, divine, and something that's been protected over the ages or something like that.
Right.
And the upper caste notion of purity is also cast
Exactly.
on top of that. And like even for me, whilst growing up, right, I've always associated Carnatic music as the songs that are sung in temples, and they only describe the gods or like folk tales or
Yeah.
whatever. And then I'm still gonna be honest, like I still don't know its full original scale. Like I have absolutely no clue. Like Adi is pretty familiar with it, and he's told me a lot of stories of how post independence, the whole, in fact, that's how recent it is, right? Post independence,
Yeah.
the whole scene changed, and it became something that was meant to become mainstream and come into public light. And as a result, it was censored, and it was people who could perform it went down in number, and became a very restricted scene. Like
We're, uh, we're actually going to do an episode on the history of Bharatanatyam
very
at some
soon, yeah.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe we'll have you again to do the history of
Yeah, you
Bharatanatyam.
should you should
Actually,
definitely be part of that conversation. Let's see if we can
Yeah.
coordinate
No,
something.
I'd love to. And yeah, I think like, so wait, what was the question actually? I
oh,
think
there
I,
was a question. Okay, there's one thing I want to tell you. There's a very interesting thing that you said about bhakti.
yeah.
I think we tend to forget that the word bhakti just means devotion, right?
Right.
It has
And
no religion or any context to it. It's not a Hindu thing to have bhakti. You
right.
can have devotion towards anything, right? And yeah, actually, that's a very very good point. Voices of bhakti.
Bhakti,
Doesn't
yeah.
Yeah,
mean
it's like I think we have this conception, like even if you think about the bhakti poets or bhakti movement, we think of, I think there's a set of Kabir or Mirabai or Tulsidas, like these kind of poets, and that's definitely part of it. But bhakti, imagining it as something broader, it just opens up so much more possibility of kind of engage. And like bhakti, the if you want to get into the root of the word and stuff, it comes from the Sanskrit root, which is, one meaning is just to share, or like to sort of distribute. And I think like really taking it in that broader sense, like yeah, it's not exclusive to Hindus or one sect of Vaishnava poets. It's really like Muslim, Christian, Parsi, Jain, Buddhist, like, and that's sort of what I've tried to highlight on the Instagram account, is like just the sheer diversity of literatures and poets and approaches to devotion that have been part of our culture, and which really push back against, I think, what we're seeing right now in terms of who is allowed to talk about religion and in what ways they're allowed to address religion. And I think like a lot of the poets who I've been posting, if they were writing today in India, like they would be arrested, they would be in jail right now. It
yeah.
really is like, it can be quite subversive and really surprising if you look back at it.
Yeah, like that's
Actually,
one of
really,
the most interesting things I noticed about your page. You like you mentioned on the, I think when we were chatting, you even mentioned there are Hindu poets praising Allah and things like that. Things like that would probably get you thrown out of the country right now. So yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, and there are just so many fascinating examples of poets who themselves kind of could not even be defined as either Hindu or Muslim, and sort of drew upon both traditions. And there are, I don't know, the list could go on of really interesting ways in which poets combined images from both traditions and for example, there's this poet from Lucknow. Her name is Rup Kumar Kumari, and she lived in like early 1900s. But she was a Hindu. Actually, she was a Kashmiri Pandit whose family settled in Lucknow, and she wrote a lot of poetry in Urdu and Hindustani about kind of the events of the Battle of Karbala and then sort of what's commemorated during Muharram. And in one of the poems, she compares Yazid, who's this tyrannical ruler who kind of defeated the prophet's family and relatives, and um, she compares him to Ravana from Ramayana, and like in the same poem. And there's just this so many other examples in which one mythological figure will be dropped into a different context or kind of played with. And yeah, I could go on, and there's so many interesting examples, but I think like if someone was writing this today, they would have to flee the country, or they wouldn't be able to publish their works. And it's a real shame that we've kind of lost
Yeah.
that.
And like you said, right, I think that whole this really super strong identity that people hold about their religion today is really sad to see. It's even with language to a certain degree, right? Like I was telling my mom the other day, we were having a very similar conversation the other day. I was like, when I was brought up on this idea of a diverse India that thrives on its diversity, and that's why the unity even exists. And in my head, because I grew up in Bangalore, but I'm from Tamil Nadu, and in my apartment complex, we had people all over India just there, right? So like I knew a little Kannada, I knew a little Telugu, I knew a little Malayalam, you know, like they were just, and I knew a little Hindi as well. So like I just knew multiple languages, so it was never like per se I wasn't like, so there wasn't this one language unifying us. The fact that there were many languages just made us know a little bit about, oh, this is how they do pujas in their house, this is how they celebrate Christmas, things like that, right? So and you just take part in all of it. Like you'd go have biryani in one place, and then you'd go back have your veg meals in in the evening when they're celebrating, when the other house is celebrating in their particular tradition. So it's a very it was that, I think that is the epitome of cultures coming together, and that's when you can say unity in diversity. uh, and that was something I was really brought up on, and it's really sad to see that go away today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was reading this poem right recently. It's about the counterculture to rebirth. So there's this whole group of people who are talking about how rebirth is like impossible and it makes no sense. Like the poem starts the fresh milk doesn't go back into the udder and ends with why would a person go back into the womb? And this was the 10th century AD. You can people have been questioning culture and traditions and religions in 10th century AD, but it's more risky to do it now. So when we say we have progressed as a society, um, it's things like this when we start questioning like how far we've progressed.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's so many examples of kind of doubt and questioning and atheism and agnosticism in kind of all of the past, whichever region of India or the subcontinent you look, there are people who have raised doubts and who have argued with the gods and who have made fun of the gods, and that can be actually really funny. There are just like hilarious poems that I've posted this Sanskrit poem about Balarama, who's Krishna's brother, who is associated with alcohol, and like there's all these poems about him just being like drunk out of his mind, and Shiva being super high on bhang, and like all of these things that we don't even think of as part of religion or devotion today. We're seen as it's all fair game for people to write about and to make fun of, and that also like brings you closer in a way to your whatever deity you're trying to connect with. It sort of humanizes, and
Yeah.
it's really interesting.
Oh, that's something I love about many. What do you say? What do you call these religions? I don't know. What do you call diverse religions? Wait, there's a word for this. A nice word for this. Like Greek and
The
Hinduism and
polytheistic.
Or
uh,
polytheism.
yeah, yeah. I like polytheistic religions because of things like this. There's this very humanizing factor to the gods. Like they make mistakes. They're very flawed. And like if you read the Mahabharata, you realize that these people are there are no heroes. They're just like really, really, really flawed individuals.
Yeah, and I
And
think
like
it's not unique just to Hindu traditions or polytheistic. There is also a history of kind of satire and playing with mocking religion. That you see, like Kabir, for example, making fun of mullahs and sort of the qazis, and it's kind of old traditions have given that there's that satire side to
mm,
it. Some of them are much more like you're right. There is no concept of blasphemy, for example, in Hindu traditions for the most part, unlike perhaps Islam. And of course, now there are people who will act as the Hindu judges to say this is blasphemy
yeah,
and you can't say this, but historically it wasn't necessarily the same. Yeah.
And I think one of the most like how these people have really succeeded, the people who say this new version of Hinduism, this new version of how religion is presented all around the world, actually, they really succeed. I think by letting people who question it today not know that there have been people in the past that have done this, and you're not alone. So you know what I mean. So for me, my first big aha moment was when I found out about Periyar, right? So I think I found out about Periyar like not a long time ago. So in my mind, the world's first atheist was probably Richard Dawkins. So I am like, so I was like, oh, I'm really fighting an uphill battle here. World's been crippled all this while. I think 2019, I find out who Periyar is and what happened with the self-respect movement and all of that. And I'm like, whoa, uh, this is this is something that's been happening for a while. And I think today I learned it's been happening since 1000 AD. And I think it's very important to make those records mainstream because there's this YouTuber called Gurubai, and he has a very nice video about it. He says, so Periyar is when Periyar had a statue of him made, he said, um, one who prays to God is foolish. He's like a fierce
Mhm.
atheist, right? So,
Yeah.
but and then people said, oh, why are you having a statue of him? He's against deities and things like that. And Gurubai makes this very nice point. He says, the reason you need to have people like Periyar documented is because when people grow up in a society like this and they may start questioning, they need to know they're not alone right now only. There have been people in the past that have questioned this and have challenged these notions. And so you don't, you feel like you aren't fighting something that's an absolute mammoth and you're trying to tame it. In fact, it's an ongoing process and it has been going on for a long while. And I think that is just like how religious texts are being preserved and we look at it and we study it as literature, we study it for devotion, we study it for multiple reasons. This also needs to be preserved as, and I think that also that needs to be studied and it needs to be something that needs to be taught in this diverse world that we're slowly moving into.
Yeah, I
yeah,
totally agree. I think that really highlights like just how important the teaching of history and sort of the public commemoration of these figures and stuff. Like I think in India and South Asia in general, like the line between remembering someone or commemorating someone and then like that falling into the same bhakti worship of figure is like it's tricky to navigate, and sometimes it's almost inevitable, but it's definitely, we have to have these kind of memorials and be able to look back and say this is not new, this is a continuation of something that has been part of our culture and religions from the beginning.
yeah. I think like one aspect that has been making people not really included in this conversation is this notion that a lot of literature and everything is about God and religion and like talking about all this is just make you religious and all this, right? But one thing people don't seem to realize is a lot of our best literature in India is about God or involves God in some way. but it is still incredibly good literature. Like there's this uh, concept of Ramayana, right? If you read the Ramayana as a story without idealizing the characters or without thinking, oh wow, a god is among these characters. It is actually a nice story. It's a very interesting story about love, war, and politics. If you exclude the religious aspect to this, and I think that's one thing that is keeping people away from Ramayana, Mahabharata, and stories like this is the religious context added on to it. So, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that I think in South Asia, there is a long tradition of what you could call secular literature and poetry that has been part of it, but definitely I would say the majority of kind of pre-modern literature has some connection to religion or mythology or the epics. And, if we think back to the Valmiki Ramayana, like Rama is not like this deity that is worshipped, in Valmiki's text. He's just kind of a prince, and yes, he is God, but he doesn't really know he's God, and it's very different from like what we later get with Kamban or Tulsi, where he's this all perfect deity that does everything right. And I think that a lot of this literature, whether it's the Ramayana or other epics, or even just other forms of storytelling and stuff, there's something that's been lost in that a lot of these figures were not necessarily the all perfect deities that we see them as today. And this is particularly true for Rama, that in the Valmiki Ramayana, he is God, but for most of the story he doesn't know that he's God, and he has to be reminded at the end. And there's much more of this human aspect to him that we don't see as much in, for example, the Kamba Ramayanam or Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas, where Rama in those tellings is all knowing, omniscient, all perfect God, and they adopt a much more devotional attitude to him. And that just changes a little bit the way the story is told and the perspective that it's given. But I think that another really interesting aspect of Bhakti poetry and Bhakti literature is that for a lot of marginalized and oppressed groups in South Asia, Bhakti literature is kind of one of the first glimpses of a utopian vision or a vision of what society should look like, a society without oppression and without violence. And whether it's Kabir or Ravidas or saints from the Varkari movement in Maharashtra, like Choka Mela, these saints who, in their poetry, gave us vision of a ideal society, which Ravidas calls Begumpura, which is like Begumpura, without city without sadness or without gum, and it's a city where nobody knows your caste and everyone can walk around freely and there's no kind of oppression or violence. And so later the people who take this vision forward are figures like Periyar and Ambedkar and leaders of the anti-caste movement. And the roots of a lot of this utopian thinking, though, is can be found in what we think of as devotional bhakti literature. And this is something that there's this book called Seeking Begumpura by Gail Omvet, who this is where I'm taking this straight from her kind of argument about this utopian thinking. But it's a really interesting angle, I think, to look at this bhakti literature as from the perspective of the oppressed or marginalized groups in society.
Yeah. So, like, I did not know the original Ramayana is actually not very idealized. That is very interesting information. Uh,
And
so wait,
there
on
are,
that, sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, on that note, is there anything like something like this something that you have learned which you find like, wow, everybody should know this. This is so interesting that this should be world knowledge, but it sadly isn't. What is something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much that I wish everyone knew about South Asia and our history and culture. But I think, bhakti poetry can really illuminate like just how interconnected the Indian subcontinent was to the rest of the world as well. Some of the things which I've posted are like these inscriptions from 2000 years ago by this Greek devotee of Vasudeva, who later became Krishna, Vishnu, and it's this inscription in I want to say Madhya Pradesh, where he created this temple for Vasudeva, who later became the deity we know as Krishna. And there are these like ancient inscriptions. There's medieval kind of literature of in praise, for example, of this. There are many African Sufi saints who are worshipped in Gujarat and along the western coast who are still revered by the Siddhi community there. And so there's songs and stories about these African saints, Baba Gaur and his sister Mai Misra and stuff, coming across the ocean from Egypt and Ethiopia. And there are so many verses from this poet Sarmad Kashani, who came from Armenia. Came from Persia. He was a Armenian Jewish merchant who came to India to trade and then converted to Islam, fell in love with this Hindu boy. They traveled across the subcontinent, and they actually were, advisors to some Mughal princes and, spiritual teachers to them. And later he was beheaded by Aurangzeb for blasphemy, and his dargah is right near the Jama Masjid in Delhi today. And they're like, I could go on and on. There's this figure, Antony Ferengi, who is a Portuguese devotee of Durga and Kali in Calcutta, who wrote these songs and poems in praise of the goddess. And there his temple to Kali is still there in Calcutta as well. And there are just so many examples, whether it's Marathi Jewish poetry or Bengali poetry that's written in the Arabic script, or even Tulsidas using Persian words like Garib Nawaz to describe Rama. There's so many ways in which the rest of the world, what we think of as kind of outside the subcontinent, has really affected cultures and languages and literature here. And so religion is just one way to see that globalization and that change that was happening. But I think it's really fascinating, and people should, yeah, I wish everyone knew about all of this stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of like how interconnected and how influential back and forth the culture has been in the past. What do you actually, especially since you live in the US, what do you make out as today's relevance culturally of India, the subcontinent as a whole, as opposed to the rest of the world? Like so I grew up in metropolitan India, right? So I was fed a lot of American pop culture. I grew up on Pogo and Cartoon Network, and I didn't read a lot of Indian folk tales, and that was that was supplementary because by the time I started growing up, it was easy to consume for one, and I grew up on a lot of American ideals, and because America's cultural export is so big and they're really good at it as well, right? A lot of what is considered normal today globally stems from an American ideal. So what do you so globally or even outside India, like in a place like America, what do you think the relevance of South Asian culture is, and do you see it changing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, that could be a whole topic in itself, sort of how perceptions of India have changed from, the 1800s until now. And there's been so many shifts, and particularly with once we get to the 1960s, where the like immigration from India ramps up, then there's so many other shifts that happen. But I think, one angle to take on it is that South Asian and particularly Indian culture has become mainstream in so many ways in American society. With particularly, we talk about yoga and mindfulness and that whole world that really has drawn on Hindu yoga traditions and traditions from other kind of religious sects. And that's sort of, if you think of like what Americans know about India, it's like Bollywood, yoga, maybe Gandhi, and a few other figures. But I think there's all of this is coming from a very upper caste Hindu idea of what Indian culture is. And, in any Indian embassy's cultural programs, anywhere in the world, it'll probably be, Bharatanatyam, Hindustani music, like Carnatic music, and those are what is showcased as Indian culture to the rest of the world. And that really plays a very strong role in how people view India and its diversity. And it really erases so much of the cultural diversity that actually exists in the subcontinent. And I think as people in the diaspora, in the Indian American diaspora, most people are coming from that upper caste background, and at least half of Indian Americans are also Hindu. And so we also internalize those images about what is India and what is Indian culture that are that broader Americans also are exposed to. And so I remember I was so shocked when I found out when I was 19 years old that Andhra Pradesh is like 2% vegetarian and 98% non-veg. And I had grown up my entire life surrounded only by vegetarian Telugu people and like my own family. And like to even think of like what I thought about my own cuisine, my own culture was like not even representative of the vast majority of this home state. It's like, it really blows your mind. And it just shows the need for more representation and voices and uplifting the voices of caste oppressed minorities, religious minorities, even within the diaspora, not to mention within India as well.
Yeah. No, because especially I think globally
Right?
speaking, right? Okay. Especially
No,
since
like
globally speaking, I think a lot of the in a lot of Indian culture is now again led from America. Because America's cultural export is so huge, and partly because they want to tap into the market or whatever it is, right, in entertainment or whatever. You still see an Indian American again, and that happens to be mostly upper caste because they had the opportunities to go there uh, and settle from the 60s, as you mentioned. Um, so you still see a very particular representation globally as well, like, and it's things like casteless collective that are that are slowly starting to change the scene here. And I don't know, I don't know if I'm hopeful that there will be a point where Indian representation comes from India. There'll be a point where it's not Lily Singh and it's probably someone like Arivu or Tenma. Uh, but uh, but even globally speaking, I do think a change is coming pretty fast. Even from like a cultural giant from America, where I can see, because people like you are discussing the discrepancies in what culture is presented as and what it has been in the past, and that's a common theme that is slowly dawning upon a lot of people. And it takes and I don't know. I'd like to say it takes very little research to sort of stumble and see, okay, wait, there's a gap in what I perceive and what has been. But I think now there's so much of jargon and false information out there where I think it'll be a little more difficult today. Because so I follow a lot of super uh, pro Hindu India news outlets just to see what the other side is talking about, and they're very proactive in what they do. Uh, so I can see someone who's Googling this. It takes one wrong Google search to come across this and jump into that rabbit hole instead of this. So yeah, I'd say proceed with caution for the people who are Googling and are 14 and want to know the
hey,
past.
I completely agree. Like today I saw a post. I follow this page called Vedic Sciences. Today they made a post about how if you're having a heart attack, if you keep saying Om, you can fix your heart attack. And I was like, wow, like imagine the world knew this. How many lives we could save if the world just knew all you need to say is Om when you're
All
having
these
a heart.
years of medical research put to shame.
Yeah, people have been studying this for like 10 years to get a PhD and become a doctor for become a cardiologist, and all they did not know. All you need to do is say Om.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
information
it's like,
knowledge that we need to pass on.
yeah, I mean, it's like, it's comical to an extent, but then you realize that like this is becoming more and more like powerful, this kind of thinking, and
Yeah.
becoming more and more mainstream. And I think
And
that is what's really worrying. And you're seeing that here too with fake news, spread of disinformation, that it's kind of this global phenomenon now. And
Yeah.
it's
And I don't know, I kind of feel like I've become like my parent, where so when I was a kid and I just scroll over the internet, my parents would be like, okay, what is this guy looking at? Is he looking at something that he's not supposed to be looking at? When I was a kid, right? Now when my dad opened WhatsApp and he just clicks on a video, I'm like, oh, please don't be something he should probably not know, because he's not going to go verify what please don't be a forward from that particular uncle that we all have, right? So, um, so it's really sad, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I kind of wish, this I'm just thinking out loud, but like I wish that these posts from Voice of the Bhakti would become like WhatsApp forwards that people are sending to like just counter this like
Yeah,
otherwise onslaught of like just nationalist like made up
very,
lies and stuff. And like the fact that if I can imagine showing like some Hindutva uncle that like the poet who wrote Pakistan's national anthem, for example, he wrote this long Urdu poem in praise of Krishna, and like if you just send him like for a few verses of that without saying who the poet is, and just being like, aren't these pretty poetry? And then he's like, oh yeah, it's like beautiful bhakti, and then you're like, guess who wrote this? The guy who wrote Pakistan's national anthem. It like
oh god,
just triggers this like shift right in your thinking, and it takes many tries. Maybe like 100 of those will get someone to open their mind a little bit
yeah,
more. But I feel like there is a potential to
I,
like,
I can tell you the structure that you need to follow. Just put the poem at the top, put some dotted, put some full stops, and then say, "Oh wow, how beautiful! What a blah 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 blah," and then more dots, and then the end. That was written by the same guy the guy who wrote this lives in Pakistan.
exactly.
Da-na-na-na.
That's how
That's all.
you need to catch them.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
oh, that's
that's
good.
how a WhatsApp forward is structured. It's structured like a joke. You have the
Setup,
context.
yeah,
Yeah, and you have something that breaks the setup. You're like, oh my god, and that's how. And you feel like, oh shit, more people need to know about this. Yeah, bro, let's make this happen.
yeah.
Let's
Yeah,
Secret
make
I'll
bench,
take some lessons
secret
from
bench
you.
listeners, you have a job. Family groups, start forwarding this.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I was completely. I still can't stop thinking about this guy that you're talking about. Beheaded by Aurangzeb. That's the only story that's been running on my mind ever since you mentioned it. Hey, what is
Yeah,
this man's story? A little bit more detail, please. I will Google this later, but I still want a little bit more context. What is this man?
sure. Yeah, no, I'm very happy to tell. So the poet who I'm talking about, his name is Sarmad, sometimes called Sarmad Kashani because he came from the city of Kashan in Iran. But he lived during the Mughal Empire times. I forget exactly which century, but basically he was born into a merchant family of Armenians who were living in Iran. And even now there's a large Armenian community in Iran. And he received a complete Jewish education. He later converted to Islam. And then when he was about 40 years old, he went to the subcontinent on kind of a business trip, basically. And there he, according to the tradition, he fell in love with this young like Hindu boy named Abhay Chand,
Wait,
who's
tradition. What is this interesting new tradition I'm hearing about? What
this is
tradition?
this is the he's a Sufi saint now, and there are biographies of him, and he is a known figure, but he's really like crosses every single border, whether it's sexuality or religion or
Wait, no,
gender.
what
And
tradition?
so
What tradition is this?
this is, I mean, his dargah is there in Delhi. He's a pretty mainstream Sufi saint. Now, I don't know how many people who are going to his dargah know this whole biography about him, but this
Oh,
is
this is
what the medieval Persian literature, the Mughal era histories that have been written about him.
I have a
This is his
feeling
kind of
modern literature say that he's a really good friend that lived with him. That's probably how they portray it.
exactly. I'm sure a lot of these are also saying, yeah, just his good friend Abhay Chand, but he actually he was much younger than Sarmad, and Sarmad like was this. He basically became a naked kind of yogi, and he, according to the story, he like went and sat outside Abhay Chand's parents' house until they let him go with him and leave the home and travel with Sarmad kind of for the rest of their life. So they became kind of companions, and he traveled all the way down to like Hyderabad, where he was interviewed by this other author who kind of asked him about Jewish religion and customs, and together they apparently translated part of the Torah into Persian. And then he went up to the Mughal court in Delhi, where he was kind of a close teacher and companion to Dara Shikoh, who was later killed by his brother Aurangzeb. And actually later, probably because of his closeness to Dara Shikoh, Aurangzeb executed Sarmad on the count of either like public nudity or blasphemy. And this is like in the 1600s, 1660s or so. And he became this kind of martyr, Sufi martyr, whose dargah is there. It's like people go there, and his poetry is beautiful. It's like it's all in Persian as far as I know. But he wrote quite a lot about sort of going beyond religious boundaries and just developing this like individual relationship with God. But yeah, I mean, he like is this Jewish Sufi gay yogi Mughal kind of figure who just breaks like every notion we have about kind of what history was like and what people were like back then. But this is part of our past.
One of the greatest Instagram.
Yeah, you've given us an individual Instagram clip to promote this. You have to understand.
Bro,
Awesome.
what's the man's name again?
Sorry, his name is Sarmad.
Sarmad, okay.
Sarmad, yeah. Sarmad.
What a baller. My God.
Yeah, I know.
What a life.
Yeah,
I think on
so
that
all of what
note-
I was saying was
Wait, no. I need to know. Sarmat what? Sarmat what? How do I find this man?
so some of them call him Sarmad Kashani. That's kind of his full name, I guess. And all of what I'm saying is coming from this scholar of religion, Nathan Katz, who
Oh my
has
God.
researched him.
Wait,
And so
I need to Google this man. Look at his
Yeah,
picture.
Sarmad Kashani, yeah.
Okay, who is listening, guys? Please just pause this and Google this man. My God, the paintings of this man are insane.
right.
What is this whole? What is going on?
Yo,
He
yeah,
is
man.
honestly truly unique figure in history,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, he definitely is naked and sitting outside places.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's brilliant. You know what? We're going to
Guys-
use this painting in the cover art if we can.
Yeah, it's pretty unique, I have to say.
Yeah.
Oh,
All
bro,
right.
this is insane. This is really insane.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and the thing is like I said, like everything I just said about his biography, it comes from this scholar Nathan Katz, and also this other scholar Sasha Prevost, who is from University of Washington. And like part of the work which I'm also trying to do is like take all of this stuff what otherwise only college professors and academics are talking about, and sort of just bring it to more general public audience. And um, it's like there's no point if it's just sitting in like college libraries and nobody is
Correct.
knowing
Absolutely.
about
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And especially when the other side of the coin, this pure version of religion, is out there in the public. I think this needs to be there in balance as well. You know what I mean? It shouldn't turn to a counterculture. I think that's also wrong. But to get a proper balance of what's out there, I think both sides of the coin should be presented equally. You're welcome on the show whenever you want to come, and if you want to share something interesting, just DM us and
Thank you.
we'll be out there. Yeah. It's been amazing talking to you. Do you want to know, maybe close in? What's your final thoughts? If there's one thing that people need to take away from this episode, what is it?
Yeah, I think the one lesson which I'm trying to push forward through Voices of Bhakti is that whatever we have been grown up whatever lessons we've been given as children or in schools or from our families about what our history is or what our culture is or what our religion is, all of those are generalizations in one way or another, and all of those are kind of incomplete pictures of what history is really like. And I think it's particularly right now when history itself is used as a weapon to oppress and sort of commit violence against minorities. It's kind of a responsibility to go back and interrogate a lot of the myths that we've been told and a lot of the stereotypes and misconceptions we have about our own identities and where our culture comes from and all of that. And so I think in whatever way you can do that, in whatever sphere of life kind of interests you, I think just looking back to like, where did this start, and is this really like thousands of years old, or is it like 50 years old, and kind of just questioning that is a place to start, and leads you to very interesting figures and people like Sarmad and some great poetry as well.
Awesome, Nikhil. It's been amazing talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And as usual, thank you so much for listening and watching. Nandri.
வணக்கம்.